David Braun completed the coaching job of the year last year, taking Northwestern from the Big Ten basement to a 7-5 regular season and a bowl win over Utah. 8 victories from 1 win just the year prior. Can he do it again? Matthew Shelton of the Wildcat Report, a part of the Rivals Network, joins me next to talk all things 2024 Northwestern Wildcats football.
From LA to Piscataway, all Big Ten all year long. This is Big Ten 10.
Last season, Northwestern, I think, caught everybody off guard. But can they do it again? Can they get to that 7 or 8 win level in 2024? To talk all things Wildcats, we welcome in Matthew Shelton, the managing editor of the Wildcat Report, the Northwestern site, as a part of the Rivals Network. Here's what I want to start with. Last season, David Braun, he heard people like me, some national pundits, Big Ten pundits out there that are saying, you're going to beat Howard, you're going to beat UTEP. Other than that, I see a lot of losses. And I think he was able to use that as motivation within the locker room, kind of that us against the world mentality throughout the season last year. Now, Big Ten opponents saw what happened last year, and I think Northwestern is more of a respectable game on these schedules. And they know that this is a solid team kind of going into this 2024 season. Considering all of that, where maybe the target's a little bit bigger on Northwestern this year, how do you expect the Wildcats and David Braun to really approach this season?
Yeah, I think the difference between last year and this year is that this year, if they want to be successful, they really have to get out to a hot start. And historically at Northwestern, that hasn't always been a strong suit. But when you look at the back half of the schedule, and they have Wisconsin, Iowa, and then even worse, you have Michigan, Ohio State back-to-back as for your last 6 games, you can't have the slow start that they had last year against, they opened 1-2. They got rocked by Rutgers and Duke, really rallied at the bye week, and like you said, ended 8-5 with a bowl win. But, this was a team that really made its turn and came out strong after its bye week, and they just don't have the time this season to do that. They have to have a successful non-conference. They have to have a good start to the conference schedule because that back half is doing them no favors.
Now, where are some of those non-conference games and some of those early games that you mentioned? Where are those games going to be played? Well, Ryan Field is no more, at least the previous version of Ryan Field. Instead, they are playing at a temporary facility, 15,000 people on the banks of Lake Michigan, where sports like soccer and lacrosse are also played on campus. What's the excitement level of the Northwestern fan base and maybe even the Northwestern team of playing in a venue like this for the next 2 seasons for a handful of games?
I think the excitement's really high. I think both in a genuine sense and maybe a little malicious. I think people are really excited to have an opportunity like this because, during the construction process, when it was found out, that basically they'd be scrapping and rebuilding Ryan Field, the team needed a place to play for 2 years. And some of the early options were like SeatGeek Stadium, which is like an hour and a half southwest of campus, or maybe playing at some of the other places in Chicago that were a real trek. And, maybe it'll be cool for 1 or 2 games, but this is an opportunity for the players and fans to be on campus and not really lose out on what it feels like to play a home senior season, or for students to have a similar effect. And I also think there's genuine excitement around what the stadium will look like. You can go check it out right now if you're in the area. They're in the process of building it on the lakeside. There's going to be great views of the lake, potentially great views of the city. But I will admit, I think there's a little bit carrying over from the days of the long grass at Ryan Field. I think there's a little bit of a malicious streak in the fandom and with the players of, getting to know that some of these teams have to come play here. And Wisconsin's going to be there in a 15,000 seat stadium. Duke's going to be there in a 15,000 seat stadium. And again, I think there's a little bit of, they might not admit it, but I think there's a little bit of a malicious streak for the fans and the team that, kind of similar to the Ryan Field 11 a.m. impact, they're pulling opponents down to that level, and you're going to have to beat them there.
Boy, and that lake effect coming off that, right? In some of these, maybe as we get towards October, it can get a little bit colder, and maybe special teams in the kick game maybe that could even be an advantage for Northwestern in some of these football games as well. All right, let's talk about what's going on between the lines. Of course, on offense, let's start at the quarterback position because Northwestern had some pretty good production last year. Of course, you had Ben Bryant that I think the quarterback room certainly took a step up there with Ben. And then when Ben was out with injury, Brendan Sullivan filled in very nicely. Now, both of those guys are gone. Ben Bryant and his long college career finally came to an end. Brendan Sullivan ended up transferring over to Iowa. Now, when you look at what is in the quarterback room right now, Ryan Helinski seems like he's been there forever as well. Jack Lausch is in there. But I think a lot of people are leaning towards former Vanderbilt and Mississippi State quarterback Mike Wright coming over from the SEC. It seems like his mobility blends into a lot of what new offensive coordinator Zach Lujan really wants to do in this offense. Do you see Wright separating himself as the guy under center for the Cats?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Coach Lujan's system that he brings over from South Dakota State, he really likes a mobile quarterback. And that was one of the key reasons for Brendan Sullivan transferring out, was basically the staff. Now, also the staff is notorious for not guaranteeing any jobs, but right. It was made clear to Brendan that the job was not explicitly his heading into fall, which led to his decision to transfer. And part of that was even on roster before Mike Wright transferred in, even on roster that the staff was liking what they were seeing from Jack Lausch, who is a more mobile quarterback. Hasn't had a lot of starts or opportunity to show it on the field, but he's a guy in high school that ran for 20 touchdowns and threw for 20 touchdowns at Brother Rice in a very competitive Chicago Catholic League. But I think it's pretty clearly going to be Mike Wright's job. Again, Northwestern doesn't make guarantees. I'm sure we might have the same run around of, we're loving what we're seeing in the room and all that stuff. But if everyone's healthy, it should be Wright's job. Again, just because what he brings with his legs, and he's got, I want to say, nearly 40 games of experience in his career, which is far more than anyone else in that room. He was brought in for a reason. And I think that was also a reason that predated spring ball. I think once they knew, or I should say they always knew that Bryant would be leaving because it was his last year of eligibility. But yeah. I think once the season ended, they knew that they wanted to bring in a transfer to at the very least compete for the job. And once Wright was available, I think it's his job to lose.
Really excited about the mobility of Mike Wright because that's a little bit different from what we saw last year. Brendan Sullivan could move around a little bit, but Ben Bryant made most of his time living in that pocket. And this pass game really took a step up last year, also partially due to what they had in that wide receiver room as well. Now, they do lose their leading receiver in Cam Johnson from last year, but there is some returning production out there at wide receiver. You look at Bryce Kirtz, 701 yards and 5 touchdowns last season. A.J. Henning, 424 yards and 4 scores via the air last year. Now, after that, the production and the experience takes a dramatic drop-off there for Northwestern. Do you think that this group can be a threat, maybe a similar threat to what it was in this past game, help these quarterbacks out like Mike Wright this season?
Yeah, I think kind of to your point, I think Wright's a much better runner than Sullivan. Sullivan can use his legs, but, Wright nearly has as many career rushing yards as Sullivan has passing yards, right? They're both around 1,300. So I do think to that extent, they'll miss Ben Bryant's arm. If you give Ben Bryant time, there's not many throws he can't make on a football field. He was around a 65% career completion percentage. Wright's around 55. So he won't necessarily, or at least to this point in his career, hasn't really shown the same ability to throw guys open or really be a dissecting accurate passer at that level. So I think that will hurt the receivers a little bit. But also, I think Bryce Kirtz and A.J. Henning really showed last year what they can do. And it was kind of Kirtz's first fully healthy season. So if he can stay healthy, I think he'll continue to improve. A.J. Henning was a transfer in from Michigan. He's taken every opportunity he's had, either in special teams in the return game or on offense, and run with it. He really has elite speed. And I think that's also another unique opportunity for Northwestern this year, is that they really have 3 players pretty unambiguously with elite speed. You have Mike Wright at quarterback, you have AJ Henning at wide receiver, and you have Joseph Hyman the second at running back. And so I think you might not see at Northwestern throw the ball as much or rack up those. I don't know if rack up's the right word, but I don't know if you'll see as much as diverse amount of success for receivers. I think they'll stay a pretty clear hierarchy with those two at the top. But for looking for that third option, it will probably be Frank Covey the fourth, who was a freshman last year. He'll be a redshirt freshman this year. Suffered an early injury and was really supposed to originally kind of split time with Henning. But then once he was hurt, that became Henning's job in full. But now that Henning's up to wide receiver 2, expect Frank Covey to probably be that third receiver for the team.
Now, it's very interesting when we talk about Mike Wright and his mobility to kind of blend that into this run game as well. They return their leading rusher, Cam Porter, once again, yet another year of eligibility. Somehow he's back on this campus, 651 yards and 4 touchdowns on the ground last year. You mentioned Joseph Hyman. There were flashes where he really showed his speed and his electricity at time, making some big plays within this Wildcats offense as well. How much of a role do you expect Joseph Hyman to play, and how do you see those two kind of splitting carries, and who do you expect to kind of lead the rushing attack this year for Northwestern?
Yeah, I think Porter will still have the lead of the rushing attack. Again, just it's still the Big Ten. People are still hitting really, really hard. And Porter's at 220 and has 4 years of experience. He's still a very talented player, but I think you're absolutely right that if you kept track of Northwestern's wild plays, guys who really jumped off the screen, the times they gave Joseph Hyman the ball last season, you noticed. Like I said, in terms of having elite speed is not something that often comes to mind with the Northwestern offense over the past few years, but whether it was against Wisconsin or a few of his other games, when they put him in space, good things happen. And so I would expect him to play a lot larger role in the offense this year, especially as a pass catcher. But I would expect Porter to still probably get about 65% of the carries. Again, he's still 220 pounds, bell cow back. Again, Hyman's really fast, but you still don't want to put 5'9", 185 between the tackles too much. Right. So look to see him get much more involved, but it's still Cam Porter's backfield.
That's what was so different about Northwestern last season. When you look at the really good seasons, we talk about those even-numbered seasons, the 2018s, the 2020s, when Northwestern was really able to peak up with a lot of victories. It wasn't necessarily their offense that was ultra explosive, but we saw some of those plays last year. Joseph Hyman, I believe it was that Maryland game that he was able to create some electricity and explosive plays within this offense as well. So getting him involved, AJ Henning can be kind of line up in multiple places as well. So hopefully that can kind of all come together for Northwestern to create some of those plays. Now, we talked about wide receivers before with Kirtz and Henning at the top, and maybe they aren't going to utilize a ton of depth beyond that. I think, and maybe another reason why is because they've got 2 pretty good tight ends on this football team as well. You look at Marshall Lang and you look at Thomas Gordon. Now, they didn't combine for a ton of production. It was 228 yards and just 1 touchdown last year. But do you think that they're kind of going to be more involved in this offense this season from the tight end spot?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Coach Lujan loves the new offensive coordinator, loves to use his tight ends. And I think Lang and Gordon are going to get a ton of work and be really strong targets. Also, you mentioned that the lake effect wins. I don't know how tall the East stands are going to be. I don't know how far you're going to be able to throw the ball. Kind of kidding, kind of not. So I would expect to see, all jokes aside, I would expect to see a lot more work given to Lang and Gordon, a few more 2 tight end sets. Again, Lujan loves, I forget the exact percentage, but loves to use shift, trade, motion. And the guys you can most often do that with are your tight ends. So expect to see Lang and Gordon, expect to see him moving around, and whatever they can give, they'll use it.
Let's head to this offensive line, because there were some positive boxes that we were able to check at those previous positions, but I think there's a lot of question marks surrounding what's going to happen on this offensive line. I feel like Caleb Tiernan and Jordan Knox are pretty good bets to play a lot this season, but who else do you anticipate kind of filling in these empty spots on the O-line?
Yeah, I think I'll probably even knock it down a little bit. I think the one player you can probably lock for next season is Tiernan at left tackle. And then I would probably say second would be Josh Thompson, who played right tackle last season. I would expect to see him at right guard or right tackle. And then everything else is kind of up for grabs. I think it's going to be earned in fall camp. Jordan Knox was very promising last season, competed for a starting job the moment he hit campus. They've got 3 transfers coming in. I would say one, again, Northwestern loathes to guarantee a spot, but Jack Bailey is coming in from Colorado, where Bill O'Boyle was offensive line coach last year. He's offensive line coach now at Northwestern. I would expect Jack Bailey to start at either center or guard. And then you have Cooper Lovelace from USC. You have Matt Keeler from Texas Tech, who are both tackles who could potentially swing inside. The 2 guard spot, the middle of the line, right? Again, I should just say basically everything to the right of Tiernan is going to be figured out in August.
It's going to be very interesting to see how that offensive line plays out with maybe some of those other spots that have shown some promise. Let's head over to the defensive side of the football. The last couple of years of the Pat Fitzgerald era, that defense was at the bottom of the barrel, but David Braun comes in. They go from the bottom of the barrel to the middle of the pack. They made a pretty big improvement last season in David Braun's first season in Evanston, Illinois. Is it as simple as David Braun coming over and having his hands on this defense, or was there kind of something more and more reasons why Northwestern made a big turnaround last season on defense?
Yeah, I think there are a few reasons. I do think number one is there were a lot of wins above replacement at the defensive coordinator position. David Braun coming in, replacing Jim O'Neill. The big difference was going from O'Neill's read and react type system, which kind of was a lot of clutter, put a lot on the plate of the defense, a lot of confusion, and you saw the results on the field. It was a team that was consistently losing by 20 plus points in conference games. And I think Braun and now the new defensive coordinator, Tim McGarrigle, who is the linebackers coach for the few years previous, including last season, they really focused on kind of boring down and simplifying the defense to let their experienced players make plays. And part of that, and one of the constant mantras throughout the season was like, if you're going to make a mistake, make it fast. And that was something that they kind of put on display, was just getting everyone on the same page, doing it fast. And even if everybody's wrong, then maybe that makes everybody right. But I will also say they really did have a lot of talented players come into their own. You had really experienced players like Bryce Gallagher, Coco Azuma, Xander Mueller, up front on the defensive line, another really strong group of guys. There was a lot of talent on the team that really came into their own. It wasn't the bad news Bears out there. There were a lot of really good football players. Rod Hurd, who a lot of people thought might go to the NFL, ended up transferring to Notre Dame after as a grad transfer. Like I said, it was a really talented group, and it was on David Braun to put him on the same page, and he did, and the results showed. But I don't think it was as simple as the system. There were a lot of players came into their own, and that really propelled the group as well.
When you have good players, the rest seems to certainly work out. You mentioned Rod Hurd transferring to Notre Dame. Let's talk about the secondary for just a minute, because that secondary gave up a lot of yards right in those back half, those last 2 years of the Pat Fitzgerald era, but they were 6th against the pass in the Big Ten last season. A big reason for that turnaround last year for the Wildcats. Rod Hurd is out to South Bend, Indiana, as we mentioned. 2 other really good defensive backs transferred both to West Virginia. Jaheim Joseph and Garnett Hollis are both out of the program. So those are some big losses in the secondary, but there may be some solid options to backfill with, including Devin Turner. He was 4th on the team in tackles last season at one of the safety spots there, and Johnson led the team with 5 pass breakups. You look at Ore Ajayi also at one of the corner spots. Do you have optimism that this group can be near the level of play that last year's secondary was?
Yeah, I do. And I think the staff does as well. If you're in a 4-3 set, they return 3 of their 4 starters. They return both starting safeties and Theron Johnson at corner. Jaheim Joseph was a loss for depth for sure. But I think part of the reason he transferred out was that the staff has really prided itself on honesty with players, and I don't think there was a path to starting for Joseph if Turner and Ozma were healthy, or even much of a a path to the kind of depth snaps he got last season. Those are guys that they're going to want out there for 85-90% of the game. So I think that transfer stings, but I don't think was entirely unexpected given that setup. Hurd leaving the program is really tough. I mean, like I said, incredibly talented player, really anchored the defense last year. There were basically 4 players who rarely came off the field, and that was Hurd, Turner, and then the 2 all-conference linebackers, Gallagher and Mueller. But I do also think there was a little bit of, again, I don't know if acceptance is the right word, because obviously when you have a player like that, you want him back. But I think most people, honestly, I think most people expected him to go pro and to try to either be drafted in one of the later rounds or find a spot as an undrafted free agent. He's leaving as a grad transfer. He has his Northwestern degree, so I don't think there were any hard feelings about him leaving for Notre Dame, and I think it's a genuine wishing of the best. I think Garnett Hollis was the one transfer that I think really surprised me and surprised a lot of people. He had a chance to come back and start and left for a West Virginia program that I don't think a lot of people really see as being that much of a better program in terms of quality or in terms of platform for like NFL prospects. So right. I think that was definitely a loss, but I think the staff hopes that Addae will be able to step up and that group will be able to perform at replacement levels. The big question will be if they can find a nickel to replicate what Hurd was doing, because he really was kind of the dream player for that role, and they really love to run a lot of 4-2-5 nickel type sets with him. So we'll see if they make that adjustment to running Kenny Soares as a third linebacker more often, or if you have guys like Robert Fitzgerald or Garner Wallace who can step up into that role.
Northwestern's 2023 season was an all-timer, and they lost an all-timer at linebacker. At least they will for the 2024 season that finished up in 2023. Man, Bryce Gallagher, he is as good as it gets. 2 straight seasons over 100 tackles in 22 and 23. A 2-time captain, only the 15th Northwestern Wildcat to do that. Multi-time All-Big Ten. You could go on and on and on about Bryce's impact on this Northwestern defense. How big of a loss is Bryce in the middle of this defense?
He's huge. It's as hard to replace as you can get. I think a huge impact for Braun McGarrigle and the team was being able to trust Gallagher to make adjustments on the field and to know the playbook cold. And, I think one of the biggest question marks, I don't necessarily want to broaden out your question too much, but Northwestern brings back a lot, but it's replacing its play caller on the field and off the field for offense and defense. They have a new quarterback, new offensive coordinator, new middle linebacker, new defensive coordinator. And I think Gallagher's role in implementing Braun and McGarrigle's defense last year, was just unparalleled. I think that was really a huge, like I said, I think a huge part of success was being able to put Bryce out in space and trust his evaluation and trust his 40 games of experience to be able to read offenses and know history and adapt the defense to what they're doing and run more simple plays with knowing that he can either adapt or tweak or make great plays out of that.
A great player and a great leader, like you said, will always set the table for maybe the future generations of defense. And I think they do have some certainly pieces to play with here in this linebacker group, even though Bryce Gallagher moves on. Of course, we're going to venture right to Xander Mueller, right? He's been right there with Gallagher. 110 tackles, 10.5 tackles for loss, led the team there. 5 sacks, 3 interceptions. He was all over the football field last year for Northwestern. He's expected to step up into that leading role, along with guys like Kenny Soares, Mac Uline in that linebacker room. What can we expect from Mueller and some of these replacements, in the absence of one of the best linebackers in Northwestern history?
Yeah, I think a lot of people expected Xander Mueller to slot over into the middle linebacker role, but based on quotes from Braun and his staff so far from the spring, that's going to be an open slot, and they're going to keep him in that will linebacker role. That spot's probably going to go to Mac Uline, who's been kind of the heir apparent, the man in waiting for the next line in Northwestern linebackers. He's a 4-star recruit in the class of 2021, top player in Illinois. Again, really talented, just hasn't been able to find his way on the field because you don't want to take Gallagher and Mueller off it. You're playing Big Ten football. You don't always have time at a program like Northwestern to get the guys the snaps you want to. So I think there's real optimism, and he's a really high potential player. It's almost strange in the COVID era of transfers and 6 years to be in a position where you're just truly starting a player who's just out of high school and hasn't really played a ton. So it feels kind of almost weird to take that gamble and make that bet, but the staff likes what they've seen, and they're betting big on U-line this season to fill Gallagher's shoes, and it'll be nice to have Mueller next to him, and he'll have a very experienced defensive line and a very experienced safety tandem behind him. So he's got good surrounding pieces. It'll be on him to step up into that role.
From what might be lost in the linebacker room with Bryce Gallagher, it's kind of the opposite on the defensive line. They return a lot of production, and they are really, really deep up front. You look at guys coming back on this defensive line. You look at Jalen Pate, Aiden Hubbard, Richie Haggerty kind of coming off the edge as well. Those are just a few of the names. They played big roles last season for the Northwestern Wildcats on the defensive front. Just how deep can this room go with some impact players on this defensive front?
Yeah, they can play 6 or 7 guys with. So a few will be situational, but I think there are 4 or 5 players that the staff would be more than comfortable starting in any given week. The hope is that it's a champagne problem, but there are a lot of players that can play and make serious contributions from that position. Aiden Hubbard's your sacks leader. Jalen Pate's another really experienced player. You have 2 6th-year guys, McLaughlin might be 5th. But you have 2 really senior guys in Richie Haggerty and Sean McLaughlin, who, again, you're talking about 40, 50 games of experience at a high level. But you've also got 2 young 4-star players in Anto Saka and Michael Kilbane who proved they can play last year. So they'll be able to, again, hopefully it's a situation of it trends more towards a champagne problem than a log jam. But they have players for every situation. They've got pass rush specialists. They've got size. It's really the strongest position on the team, which is really crazy to think about given where the defensive ends and defensive tackles were last year, where, there were only a handful of scholarship players at defensive tackle. And there was a lot of uncertainty around defensive end. And now the staff's tripping over playable players.
Let's head to the schedule for Northwestern this season. Big Ten, well, they certainly didn't do the Wildcats any favors to, at least for an easy path, to get back to bowl eligibility. And bowl eligibility could be difficult for the Wildcats. You've got Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, and Ohio State on the back half of the schedule. Of course, arch rival Illinois at Wrigley Field as well. How important is it starting hot, getting wins over the Dukes, over the Marylands, and the Indianas early in the slate?
It's huge. Again, I think it's a testament to the new world we live in that you forgot that they play at Washington. So just throw that cherry on top. It's a grueling schedule. They had a little bit of a friendly one last year, which helped them get going late, but they have to get going early. You have to leave the Miami, Ohio, Duke, Eastern Illinois stretch 2-1. It's a must to stay competitive in the schedule because it's cumulative. It's like the games where you're at Purdue or you play Illinois. If you play those in a vacuum, maybe Northwestern wins 6-7 times out of 10. Those are teams they beat last year, but both were close games. And now you're playing Purdue after you play Wisconsin and Iowa, after the team has that fatigue and has that stamina, has the potential injuries. Same thing. You're not playing Illinois in a vacuum. You're playing Illinois after you play Ohio State and after you play at Michigan. So they need to they need to start 2-1. They probably need to start 4-2 if they want to keep the hopes of a bowl game alive.
So we kind of just set the table with the difficulty on the back half of the schedule, how important and a hot start is in the early part of the schedule as well. What would you consider success in the second year for David Braun at Northwestern?
I think, I don't know, maybe it's setting the bar a little low. I think success is probably 5 wins because that probably gets them maybe an easier blanket statement is making a bowl game again. Sure. because with the academic progress rate, they should be probably one of the better teams with 5 wins. Again, there are just some really hard games to see Northwestern having a shot in. Again, Ohio State, Michigan, Washington. Though I don't know, we'll see how a Jetfish team looks like. But I think success is if you can get to 5 wins with this schedule. I think that shows that there's proof in the pudding, and you can continue to recruit on that, continue to build a foundation, and show that it wasn't just an interim coach bounce.
A tremendous season in year number 1 for David Braun, Big Ten Coach of the Year. Can he do it again? Can he prove everybody wrong for the second straight year? It's going to be fun to find out. Matthew Shelton, the managing editor of the Wildcat Report, of the Northwestern site as a part of the Rivals Network. Always great to talk Purple Cats football, and I'm sure we'll see you down the road. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching Big Ten TED, where it's all Big Ten all year long. Make sure to like the video to spread the word of Big Ten TED to the masses, and subscribe to the channel for updates on Big Ten content that drops every day.